Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Web Services Update session with a focus on Harmony Core. Today, I'm Rachel Gibson, obviously, if you were there yesterday, and I'm here with Jeff Green, who is our Chief Technology Officer. And here's just a little bit of info about Jeff. He joined Synergex in 2006 and brought his passion for open source and standard-based technologies with him. His first contribution to our product suite was Synergy DBL integration for Visual Studio, which he architected and implemented. He also championed the importance of running Synergy on .NET Core and was the lead developer of that project. So Jeff has been instrumental in Synergex's embrace of service-oriented architecture and standards-based technologies. As with all of our sessions, there will be time for Q&A after the presentation with an opportunity to use the mic. In the meantime, you can post questions to the Q&A or chat area. And as always, with tech issues, please contact classes@synergex.com. Let's get started.
Welcome to the Harmony Core update. I'm Jeff Green, Synergex Chief Technical Officer. Before we get into the actual update parts, I'm going to go over just a quick overview of Harmony Core, really for anyone that's just joining us who maybe hasn't paid as much attention to it in the past, just so you know that this matters to you. So what is this Harmony Core thing? We say that it's a framework of patterns, practices, codegen templates, and libraries used to create RESTful web services that expose Synergy data and logic. That's sort of like our official kind of dictionary definition. But the main gist of it is that if you have a Synergy application and you need to modernize it or allow other developers to integrate with your software, Harmony Core is your ticket to get there. So here's the main topic areas for Harmony Core, the libraries and technologies that we sit on top of. Traditional Bridge is the tool that you reach for when you have some bit of code that needs to be web servicified, but for some reason you can't just compile it and run it directly in Synergy.net. So Traditional Bridge uses just a regular old Synergy compiler and runtime to do its work. That means that you can run it on OpenVMS, or if your code is tightly coupled with existing toolkit applications, it can be a lot easier to get it into Traditional Bridge than taking it straight to Synergy.net web services. And we have some new features that I'll talk about later that can actually help you get there a little bit easier in that scenario. Traditional Bridge can run over a network using encrypted SSH connections, or it can be local on the same machine as your web server. So there's a lot of flexibility there in terms of how you can deploy it in your environment. The next big ticket item is OData, and that is the standard that we use that defines how clients interact with your web service. Because of this OData standard, you can take advantage of the significant OData tools ecosystem. And Dan Ellis has a session in this conference that leverages exactly these tools to connect into Power BI. EF Core and Synergy.net are really sort of the glue that holds all of this stuff together. So EF Core manages all of the data access side of things, whether you're using SAM files and Synergy data, or you're using some other data provider in order to get at maybe something in like a SQL server or something. But EF Core brings all of that together into just the one interface, and Synergy.net lets you take your valuable existing Synergy business logic and run it directly in .NET. This is the highest performance, most scalable way to run your business logic. So we're always looking for ways to make it easier to get your code running natively in .NET. We think you'll be significantly more successful if your application has an API. That's why you always hear us at every conference and countless webinars talking about putting an API on your software. But why? Why do we think that? Well, APIs make you sticky. If your customers have plugged into your application and fit the best of breed solutions to every problem they have, they're not going to want to switch to a different vendor. They're stuck to you because no one else does that. That deep integration gives you a competitive edge and ensures that your customers stay engaged with your software. Additionally, UIs change at a pretty incredible rate. On this slide, I've included just a few logos for UI frameworks that you might choose from today. This is actually like a tiny subset of the available logos, but I didn't want to totally pack the slide with them. But that's really just the nature of UI frameworks today. What's hot today is pretty unlikely to be what's hot tomorrow, and they'll just keep changing as time goes on. And throughout history, even as far back as like Babylonia in 200 BC, we see humans tackling problems that are incredibly complex by splitting up these large problems into much smaller, separately solvable subproblems. And this is called a divide and conquer approach. So splitting your back-end and front-end work into smaller subproblems that are independently tackleable, it lets you divide that large problem up and conquer it separately. So software today is definitely falling into that category of very complex requirements. So we think this is a good direction for you to go in. Okay, so hopefully maybe I've convinced you want an API for your application, or you were already convinced. And you might be asking, can I actually make this stuff work in the environments that I currently deploy in? And the short answer is yes. The slightly longer answer is yes, but maybe you have to add an extra server into the mix in order to glue it all together. It sort of depends on if the platform you normally run on is directly supported by Microsoft with .NET 6. So if you ship on Windows today, there's no new requirements. If you're on a new enough version of Windows to be supported by Synergy and Synergex, then you're covered for this conversation. If you're on Linux, the sort of base level of compatibility is that XF Server will work and traditional bridge will. If you want to run the web server directly from Linux, you'll need at least a Linux kernel 3.15 on a distro that is supported by .NET 6. That's a pretty low bar in terms of requirements for Linux kernels. So we think most people can probably hit that, and if not, you can just add an extra VM into the mix to satisfy that requirement. For OpenVMS customers, .NET does not run on OpenVMS, but you can take advantage of XF Server and traditional bridge in order to still run your code and store your data on OpenVMS, and just have the web server on a Windows VM or a Linux VM or a container or something like that. So it's not a particularly onerous requirement. You might be asking yourself, will I have to convince management to upgrade all of our existing Synergy applications to use the latest Synergy tooling in order to take advantage of this stuff? And while we do think it's in your best interest to keep your Synergy versions up to date, for this conversation, no, your main app will not need to be on the latest versions for this. We do have some minimums, and there is something of a gradient of features around what version of XF Server you have running if you're using XF Server for this. Linux and OpenVMS users have it easiest because you can just have an alternate Synergy install and keep your main application running on whatever tested version you have today, but you could take advantage of all the latest everything specifically for your Harmony Core service without having an impact on the rest of your main application. Windows users do have a minimum requirement for Synergy version 11 in order to support traditional bridge, but if you're just trying to run Synergy.NET code or use ISAM files over OData endpoints, There's no dependency on the system install because we basically just package all of that stuff up into your .NET 6 deployment folder. So there just isn't any system level dependency for those self-contained applications. So if you want to get started with Harmony Core, we have, prior to this taping, obviously this number will go up a little bit, but prior to this taping, we have about 15 hours worth of recorded content on our YouTube channel, where we cover everything from making an end-to-end application in React with the Harmony Core services on the back end, to we have Web Services Workshop, where Steve covers from start to finish, creating, deploying, and dealing with a Harmony Core web service. So there's a lot of video content that we have out there. Beyond the video content, the main source of information for Harmony Core is our wiki on GitHub. If there's something missing there, feel free to post an issue on GitHub so we can enhance the documentation or find it for you if it was hidden. We think the docs there are actually pretty good and are generally pretty helpful in directing people in some sort of productive direction. But definitely feel free to post issues if there's something that you feel is missing. All right, so what have we been focused on since the last conference? A couple of main areas here. .NET 6 was the big one. We've also done some enhancements in Traditional Bridge. We've been extending our capabilities in the Harmony Core CLI tool. CodeGen's picked up a lot of new tags to support Harmony Core use cases, and we're now supporting deployment of Harmony Core services directly on Linux. If you're interested in that last bit of topic, please attend the Steve Ives session on this topic. So .NET 6, as with every other .NET version upgrade that we've seen in recent years, has brought us more significant speed improvements. So everything just keeps getting faster. It's definitely a theme that they are going with in their development, basically focused around like, how can we make the requests per second for ASP.NET Core websites? How can we make that number go higher? And they just keep grinding away at it, making it go higher. So we get to benefit from all of that work, and this version is no different. So there's been a little bit of an evolution on our Swagger tooling over the years. Initially, we were sort of code generating the definitions basically just based off of the OData endpoints that we understood. In the 3.1 version of the product, we started relying on dynamic generation of Swagger docs. And that brought us some easier management and more accurate, a little bit more complete Swagger docs. And in version 6, we no longer have sort of a third-party provided library that's doing this. It's actually just built into the underlying ASP.NET Core and OData libraries. So what that means for you is that all of these dynamically generated docs now represent all of your controllers and all of your endpoints, instead of just the ones that we, CodeGen, understood and code generated. So we think that's a better experience for your client devs who are consuming that information. This also represents the current long-term service branch from Microsoft for .NET, ASP.NET Core, and EF Core. And staying on their release cycle is important in order to maintain the security of your web services. The latest release of the underlying OData libraries brings pretty significant changes to how requests are routed and how endpoints are registered. Thanks to CodeGen and the Harmony Core CLI tool, these changes have been actually pretty transparent to anyone who's doing an upgrade for Harmony Core, but there are some benefits that come along with it, which is that it's actually significantly easier to get working routing for your custom code. It used to be a little bit difficult, and sometimes you didn't know who was doing the routing and why was it ending up running the controller that it was. and it could be difficult to debug, but they've added some diagnostic tools into the product in OData and ASP.NET Core that really make it a lot easier to know why did my controller not get called, or why did my controller get called with the wrong data. It makes working in the environment quite a lot easier. So back near the turn of the century, Synergex released XF Server Plus to enable developers to expose their business logic to clients over a network. So to say that we've seen a lot and learned a lot over that time span would probably be a bit of an understatement. One of the main complaints that we've heard over the years is just that it's too difficult to split toolkit code from the business logic and sort of web serviceify it. So initially, when we started the traditional bridge project, we implemented a SignalR connector on top of it to try and make this a little bit easier, simply because your web clients would be able to directly interact with it, and because SignalR is stateful, you could more easily bring over that tightly intertwined toolkit code and turn it into a web service, even if it wasn't all the way to a RESTful web service. So building on that, we've added the ability for your server-side traditional Synergy code to call back to your application when it's in the middle of processing a request. So you can imagine the client has started some request, and in your toolkit application, you used to have a pop-up that came up halfway through running this important logic that said, hey, user, you need to decide between this path or that path, or provide this additional information because there was some kind of conflict. So it's now possible, because of this two-way traditional bridge, for you to make that request back out, even in a web services environment, to get it answered by the calling client. That might get literally prompted to the user, or it could be answered programmatically by the client because the client has more information. But either way, it lets your code that is currently trapped inside of toolkit stuff to make it out into web services just a little bit easier. So this isn't the sort of thing that you would want to use for each and every one of your methods, but it's really there to help you for those really hard, sticky bits of application that you need to keep around, but they're just really intertwined, and you're finding it difficult to separate it completely. Seemingly, with each new version of Harmony Core, we get faster in this area, and this release is no different. So traditional bridge specifically has seen some significant speed improvements, some significant improvements in the amount of time it takes for us to negotiate a new SSH connection. And generally that's because the underlying libraries, and specifically .NET 6 Stream libraries, have significantly improved. So we get to stand on top of those libraries and pick up the benefits frequently. The last bullet here on my slide is actually really kind of selfish on my part. Most support cases involving Harmony Core end up in my inbox, and I obviously want less things in my inbox, and particularly I don't want high priority support emails in my inbox. So I decided to prioritize logging improvements for some weirdly common issues. The two most common issues that make it to me for traditional bridge is code that has a stop statement in it, and code that unintentionally prints some text to standard out. I think we can all guess what happens when you call stop in Synergy. The process terminates and the caller has absolutely no idea why, which is not very helpful in a web service environment. It's a little bit trickier with the accidental printing. It basically looked to the traditional bridge log as though your request executed perfectly, and it returned data back out. And then the .NET side would claim that the remote end failed to respond. It wouldn't make a whole lot of sense. And in both cases, we've now managed the unexpected and log enough info into the right places that you can diagnose these issues yourself. So that's either on the .NET side itself. So when the exception is generated because the call failed, it will include the logs along with it that tell you where your code had a stop statement, why did it stop running, and it will also tell you, in addition to the request data that was sent over, if you had some kind of accidental printing that has broken protocol for traditional bridge, it'll give you the actual text that got printed out that broke the protocol. And so far that's been really helpful in diagnosing these issues and solving them a lot faster with a lot less of my effort. The Harmony Core CLI tool started out as really just a way to keep your CodeGen templates up to date and your NuGet packages in sync with our supported versions. In this release, we've tacked a couple of critical bits of maintenance in there that are issues that you would experience after having a Harmony Core solution. For one of those easy to predict requirements is that upgrades between major versions need to be easy. So when you run an update to Harmony Core 6, we read all of your configurations and load all of your projects in the tool. And then the tool starts fixing all of the known little project file inconsistencies that have built up over the year and things that just would generally have prevented you from making that upgrade to .NET 6. So it does all of those things automatically. It won't fix your custom code for you. So if you have written code and it's built in .NET and it has some dependency on a namespace that's no longer available or something that's changed, this won't fix that for you, but it does pretty much all of the other Harmony Core related tasks that need to be done. Now, regen.bat is very flexible. If you've watched any of our presentations or webinars over the years, you've seen us pop open a text editor and go into regen.bat, and it's pretty easy to turn features on and off or add new structures. But as we add new functionality to Harmony Core, it's become difficult to maintain regen.bat at customer sites. So regen.bat, very flexible, but it can really only take us so far. So we've been working to integrate regen.bat functionality, CodeGen, and the Harmony Core CLI tool. There's some scripting support and possibly most importantly, a new graphical user interface. And when evaluating how we were going to build the GUI, it was really important to us that it be very familiar to you all, but still cutting edge and high performance, cross-platform. Really, users should feel like they're living in the future. So we reached for the latest GUI framework from Xamarin founder Miguel de Icaza, and we think you'll like the result. Got the Harmony Core CLI tool, and there's a lot of different commands that I can use, but what I'm going to show you here is the GUI tool, and it's new. So you can see it has a very familiar look and feel to it as command line applications go, but it's actually willing to be driven by a mouse, which is pretty nice. And scroll wheels and stuff like that work. Keyboard still works as you would expect it to work. But the most important thing is this actually does allow you to control all of your settings for a Harmony Core project. So a lot of times what people end up having to do with regen.bat was anytime you wanted to add a structure, you had to go find in the regen.bat where you wanted to add the structure, put the name in there, go find the associated structure alias also in the regen.bat, make sure you put the alias in the right position, and then rerun regen.bat, get your file out and add it to your project and go on your merry way. So this is just making that stuff a little bit easier by providing some GUI around it. So I have a picker here when I go to add a new structure that contains structures that are available to be added. So I could just pick one if I wanted to, and it would pop up.
in the list. And I can also do things like control which generators are getting run for that structure. Also with a picker. So there's little checkboxes next to the ones that are turned on and little dashes next to the ones that are turned off. There's also helpers here, graphical helpers for some of the more, I should pick one that actually has one. Some of the more complicated concepts to manage inside of a Harmony Core regen scenario, like this relationship specification. So these are for when the Synergy repository is not capable of representing fully the relationship that you're trying to expose out through OData, or you need to customize something about that relationship. Maybe you need to make sure that it gets exposed with a certain name. But these things are all managed either through the long description field in repository or through a Harmony Core customization file. And the GUI here is building our Harmony Core customization file and provides pickers around things to make sure that you are picking valid scenarios. So basically, this just offers up all of the different things that you might need to do for Harmony Core configuration. We are still planning on extending it, and I'll talk more about that later.
All right, so this isn't strictly Harmony Core, but I felt it was important to include here because CodeGen gets pretty continuous development, and a lot of that work is done specifically to support Harmony Core requirements. So specifically, we have significantly enhanced and overhauled the way CodeGen understands and generates code for Synergy method catalogs. So that's to support the traditional bridge use case where we're taking a existing XS Server Plus set of methods and we're migrating it to traditional bridge. There's also now significantly more control over the pluralization step that happens when naming controllers and structures. This was done in response to some customer requirements and some basically just difficult to solve use cases with the naming of things. So it's seen some pretty significant use at this point. There is just a whole load of new Harmony Core specific tokens that have been added in CodeGen. And most of them are around data type handling or custom field validation. Steve has also just recently added what he's calling tweak support to reduce the template management overhead that we experience. So prior to tweaks, if you wanted to change the behavior of some naming, you had to use these like full-sized if expressions around everywhere that you were trying to expand something, and it was very onerous. And so he's introduced these tweaks that change how a token operates rather than having to put the token checks and if statements everywhere scattered throughout. So for improved handling of literals, it turns out that a lot of you have either single or double quotes inside the descriptions for your repository fields. Harmony Core templates commonly use those descriptions from repository in your generated code. Usually these are to support things like Swagger, so that those comments will come out to the client devs who are using your API. This has led to a significant number of compiler errors and a lot of manual tweaks over the years. And we've fixed this inside CodeGen now so that template authors can choose how quotes are handled inside of literals. Essentially, you can choose to say, this literal is going to be surrounded by double quotes, or this literal is going to be surrounded by single quotes. And then CodeGen will figure it out and make sure that whatever it puts out doesn't break your single quote or double quote surrounding. And the final big ticket item in CodeGen is structure input files. So structure input files are really just a JSON file that lets you specify a list of structures and some options, but it's kind of a game changer if you're in an environment where you have 2,000 plus structures that need to be code generated for, and trying to manage all of that stuff as a space delimited list inside of something like regen.bat was very, very difficult. You were either having to break it up into multiple CodeGen calls, or you were having to produce the much more in-depth, full-sized CodeGen task set JSON files. And trying to manage those as a user was significantly more difficult than we wanted it to be. So the structure info files really just button that up and make it an awful lot easier when you're in that huge number of structures kind of environment. So that's the overview of things that we've done. Up next, here's what we're being asked to add. It really should be no surprise to anyone that people always want more samples, more docs, more videos, more scenarios to be covered. So we're looking at that. We'll always be adding more samples, more docs, more videos, more scenarios. Harmony Core sits on top of the Synergy Select class, and one limitation that brings us is around how we support mixed or multiple XF server environments, where the two sides of a join, the data is residing on two different servers. And directly translating that scenario to a select class would result in pretty poor performance. It's having to make a request out for every single record that it joins, and that kind of defeats the purpose of using a join. But Harmony Core knows a little bit more about your query because we have sort of the whole query. We know about your relations, and we basically just have more information than the select class has. So we think it should be possible, even in one of these multiple XF server type environments, to create an optimal execution plan that runs quickly and gets the job done for you. We continue to have some outstanding work around supporting multiple record objects. So that's things like a notes field or an expansion record, where you have these like multiple ISAM records that have to get glued into a single logical thing. So we're still working on that. We're still getting that request. We know it'll get there hopefully soon. And in Synergy version 12, the runtime team has added the ability to explicitly control having multiple parallel XF server connections. So we're going to need to put in some code on our side to take advantage of that and manage those XF server connections. And this is to support very large deployments of Harmony Core that either need to open thousands of individual files or need to support load balancing across multiple XF server connects. So that's what we're directly getting asked for, but here's what else we think is important. We think that we can further enhance the Swagger docs using the information already contained in repository. So that's things like embedding examples for client, putting the descriptions for fields, methods, parameters, all the way into the Swagger browser. Currently, we aren't able to provide the sort of interactive Swagger browser experience for authenticated services. So it's a lot less useful there than we would like it to be. We think we can fix that. So that's something that we're going to be prioritizing. Currently, nested groups and arrays, they end up flattened into sort of a names / numbered component field. This comes from CodeGen, and it's been the way CodeGen deals with nested groups and arrays for all time. So it's not new, but we've added some support into CodeGen to try and take these previously flattened groups and turn them into distinct object levels and actual arrays, because the web services sort of front end to this is entirely happy to be dealing with distinct object levels. And we think any JavaScript developer, client-side developer is going to want them to be distinct objects in an array, as opposed to a bunch of naming convention things that are just flattened and more difficult to work with. So that's one place where we are working to improve what gets code generated for the front end developers. There are some new capabilities for the select class in version 12 that enable order by for joined legs. And we need to take advantage of that. And we need to take advantage of some other as yet unannounced features that will eventually be in the product. So that's definitely an area to watch as we take advantage of more stuff that the select class offers. And finally, more logging, more metrics. It's basically the battle cry of operations professionals. We've already been adding these things. We'll continue to add them as we find good high value metrics or logging to add. And we really place a high value on this sort of ops/DevOps experience. So problems need to be easily diagnosed in production environments and not just in development. So that means logging and metrics and telling people how to collect those logs and collect those metrics. So that's where we're headed there. And what are we thinking about for the CLI tool itself? We're looking to automate as much stuff as possible. So there's some much tighter integration between CodeGen, Regen, and your Visual Studio projects. So if you go add new structures, they get added into the projects where they're supposed to go. If you remove a structure or turn off a feature and it causes a file to no longer get generated, that we either let you know that that needs to be removed from the project, probably needs to be removed from the project, or we go remove it for you. Either way, more automation there for your project files and your CodeGen sort of overall experience. We think we can really improve the experience when you're adding sort of net new features. So as an example, adding unit tests where they weren't previously turned on in your project requires you to run some project templates and add some stuff to a solution file. It's not really difficult, but there's more steps to it than we would like, especially when we have this nice Harmony Core CLI tool that could really just do those things for you at just a click of a button. Next up is we think we want to integrate sort of deployment and debug functionality for cross-platform. So for those of you that are taking advantage of the deploy to Linux support or deploy to WSL2 on your local Windows machine, being able to package these things up easily and put them where they need to be in order to run them in your development. We think the CLI tool can help with that, and it will result in a lot less batch files and a lot less typing out long scripts or forgetting, did I copy this file there? Don't worry about it. It was covered by the packaging step. And finally, in the automation, we added capability to generate test values for unit tests so that those unit tests were running in your environment with your data, so that they were testing that your environment would be working correctly. And originally, those were a little bit difficult because you all had to choose basically like record keys. Go read this record, and then the generated code will read that record and then validate some properties about it. And what we did is we made a test value generation tool that uses CodeGen and on all of this information that we have to go scan through your data files in your development environment and produce these unit test values. So it comes up with, here are the values that we need to test, and then it plugs them into the places that it needs to be, and they can run, and the unit tests work, and it validates that the shape of your data against your API actually works. So that part's great. We want to put a little bit more automation in there because right now you have to do a bunch of manual steps in order to get that to pop out, and it's more work than we would like it to be. So that's that. And also in the tool, just generally looking to improve the UI experience. So you've seen the new GUI in there, and we want to plug in some additional ways to manage your feature enablement surface things a little bit better, controlling the bits and pieces of which part of a structure gets exposed, which part of a interface gets exposed, and also managing any custom templates that you have in a sort of consistent way that'll be a lot easier for you to manage going forward. And that's it. Who has the first question?
All right, so we've got a couple questions here. The first one is, will Harmony Core target .NET 7 or wait until .NET 8 for its next major version?
So currently we're thinking about sticking to the long-term support versions of .NET. So we'll go from .NET 6, which is an LTS, to .NET 8, which is the next LTS. There will probably be a branch of Harmony Core in the repository that is targeting 7 in the interim, but we won't actually, unless there's a really good reason to do so, we won't actually release packages for 7. We're just going to be building it there so that we, stay sort of on target with the changes that are being made underneath us.
Great. Next question. If I build a REST API, can I still write a desktop application?
You can. So REST APIs work just fine in desktop applications or web applications or with integration. So it's not, it doesn't limit you to what kind of client you can make. You can make pretty much any kind of client you want. Just about every environment you can go to has the ability to make RESTful API calls. So it's really just a very flexible kind of deal.
And one more. How serious are you about this CLI UI thing?
Pretty serious. It's so it's a command line utility, so it probably should actually show up in the command line. But it's I actually think it's a pretty nice command line experience. So I actually kind of like the way that it looks currently. And also it was really easy to make. I think everyone here knows how fast it can be to make command line interfaces. And this was no exception. It took me a couple hours to make what you saw in that demo. And it's actually just to highlight Gordon's question here. The SignalR is also useful for applications which need to know which company, user, department, region you're logging in as. That can work, yes, with SignalR. It can also work more or less that way with JWTs. Yes, they're potentially being passed, but it's kind of behind the scenes that it's being passed for you. So there's multiple ways to solve that problem. But yeah, SignalR stateful connections can be really useful for keeping around state in between calls.
Just want to thank everyone here for joining, and we really hope to see everyone tomorrow at our Visual Studio update session with with Tim, and tracking down the real world problems in today's API-based solutions.